Charlene Downes disappeared in November 2003, 4.5 years ago. She gave her mother a kiss on the cheek and said she'd see her later, but she was never seen or heard from again.
Almost 2.5 years later, 2 takeaway food workers were arrested and tried. It was claimed they disposed of her body by turning it into kebab meat.
So my daughter's been missing since Saturday night. I think she's been back by now, but she hasn't returned.
We have worked tirelessly in our pursuit for justice for Charlene and her family.
But tell us where Charlene is, and I still believe someone out there does know where Charlene is.
We must now accept that we don't have sufficient evidence to secure convictions in this case. This does not mean that the investigation that was launched when Charlene disappeared is at an end. The inquiry will remain open.
And knows more than they're letting on as well. I still truly believe that. I still truly believe that.
Blackpool, a seaside town built on neon lights, arcades, and the promise of escape. But on the night of November 1st, 2003, something slipped into its shadows, something that has never come back out. 14-year-old Charlene Downes vanished without a trace. No dramatic chase, no screams, no witness who could say for certain what happened in those final minutes. One moment, she was just another teenager weaving through the busy streets of the town center, and the next, she was gone. The pavements that thousands walk every weekend, Talbot Road, Dixon Road, the North Pier Drag, became the last known markers of her life. A trail cut short, a trail that, even 2 decades later, still ends in darkness. Her family reported her missing that same night, expecting, hoping she would walk through the front door with a teenage excuse and a tired smile. But she never did. By morning, Blackpool police realized this wasn't a runaway case. This was something else, something far more serious. And so began one of the most disturbing and controversial missing persons investigations in modern British history. An investigation riddled with rumors, failures, collapsed trials, and questions that still haunt the town to this day. 2 decades on, Charlene is still missing, and the truth about what happened that night remains buried somewhere beneath the lights of Blackpool. Before the news headlines, before the rumors, before the case collapsed into chaos, there was simply Charlene Downes, a girl growing up in Blackpool, trying to navigate a world that wasn't always kind. Charlene was the kind of teenager people remembered. Bright smile, sharp sense of humor, a voice louder than her size suggested. She came from a big family, a busy, sometimes chaotic home on Buchanan Street where siblings argued, laughed, and lived on top of each other the way large families do. School wasn't always easy for her. Life wasn't either. But Charlene had a resilience about her, a toughness born from growing up in a seaside town where thousands visit, but few get out. She loved music, she loved being around friends, she loved the feeling of freedom that came with wandering the promenade, the arcades, the noise and lights that made Blackpool feel bigger than it really was. Her mom, Karen, described her as funny, stubborn, vulnerable in ways she didn't always show. A girl who still hugged her little siblings but was desperate for independence. At 14, Charlene was caught in that fragile in-between stage. Not quite a child anymore, but not yet old enough to understand the dangers that lurked behind the bright front of the town she grew up in. She trusted easily. She was naive in the way young teens often are. And in the streets she knew best, the streets she believed were safe, someone saw an opportunity. Someone took advantage of that trust. To understand Charlene's disappearance, you first have to understand her, a teenager searching for belonging, affection, and freedom, in a place where the wrong people were always watching. This is the story of what happened when the bright, messy life of a 14-year-old girl collided with a darkness she could never have imagined. Saturday, November 1st, 2003. The day began like any other. Nothing in the morning hinted at the nightmare that was coming. Charlene left home with her older sister, Rebecca. The two wandered through Blackpool's busy center, the arcades humming, the last of the tourist season drifting away on the cold autumn air. CCTV captured them around 3:25 p.m., walking through the town just like hundreds of other teenagers that day. But sometime after that, Charlene split away. Her sister went home. Charlene didn't. Instead, she stayed around the promenade area, the spot she knew best. The strip of arcades, takeaways, and late-night noise that for kids her age felt like freedom. Crowds drifted in and out, headlights smeared across wet pavements, and somewhere in that blur, Charlene moved alone. Reports place her near Talbot Road and the surrounding back streets as evening fell. These were the streets her parents would later say she should never have been around, places known for pulling vulnerable kids into dangerous situations. But Charlene was 14. She thought she was invincible. And Blackpool at that hour hides its darkest edges behind neon. Witnesses claimed they saw her talking with people she knew, hanging around the usual spots. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, nothing that made anyone realize they were watching the last confirmed movements of a missing child. By around 11 p.m., the final sighting came in, a fleeting moment near the town center, so ordinary that nobody realized its importance until it was too late. After that, silence, no CCTV, no phone calls, no sightings that could be verified. Charlene Downes simply vanished somewhere between the glow of the arcades and the back streets where the light doesn't reach. Blackpool kept moving. Music played, bars closed, night turned to morning, and Charlene was gone. By sunrise, her family were already worried. By midday, police had begun to sense something was wrong. By the end of the weekend, they realized this wasn't a runaway case. It was the beginning of a disappearance that would haunt the town for decades. The last day of Charlene's known life wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary. And that's what makes it so terrifying. She didn't walk into danger. Danger was already waiting for her. When Charlene didn't come home, her family barely slept. They waited, argued, searched the streets themselves, convinced she would stroll back through the door with a teenage excuse. But by the next morning, something felt different. Charlene had never vanished overnight before, and so her family reported her missing. At first, Blackpool police treated it like most teenage disappearances, a likely runaway who would turn up within hours. After all, hundreds of teenage missing reports come in every year. Most end quickly, but this one didn't. As officers dug deeper into the CCTV, the timelines, the last sightings, a troubling pattern emerged. Charlene wasn't just late home, she had dropped off the map. Detectives began checking the usual teenage hangouts, arcades, the promenade, friends' flats, politely asking questions, expecting answers that never came. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. No one could say where she might be. Within days, the tone of the investigation shifted. This wasn't a runaway. This was something far more serious. Police combed Blackpool town center, distributing leaflets, conducting door-to-door inquiries, and seizing hours of CCTV footage. But the cameras that did exist in 2003 were grainy, inconsistent, and often pointed in the wrong places. Critical areas of the town, including where Charlene was last seen, had no CCTV coverage at all. Officers appealed to the public. Posters went up. Local news ran the story. The Downes family appeared on television, pleading for their daughter's safe return. But behind the scenes, detectives were becoming increasingly concerned. Charlene wasn't answering her phone. Her bank account was untouched. Her clothes, belongings, and personal items were all still at home. There was nothing, no message, no movement, no trace. to suggest she had ever planned to leave. And as the days passed with no sign of her, a grim possibility settled over the investigation. Charlene Downes may have been taken. The case was escalated, more officers assigned, specialist teams brought in. What started as a missing persons report was rapidly becoming one of Lancashire Police's most troubling mysteries. The public didn't know it yet, but detectives were already looking in one particular direction. One area of Blackpool where Charlene was known to hang out, where adults mixed too easily with vulnerable teens, and where some officers feared something predatory might be happening. It wouldn't be long before this investigation exploded into national headlines, arrests, accusations, and one of the most controversial collapsed trials in British history. But in these early days, it was just a family desperate for answers, a police force scrambling for leads, and a girl who had been missing far too long. As the days stretched into weeks, detectives began focusing on a specific area of Blackpool's town center, a strip of takeaways, cafes, and late-night hangouts where Charlene and other vulnerable teenagers were known to spend time. It was here that the investigation took a dramatic turn. Police zeroed in on two men who worked at a local takeaway. Both were familiar faces in the neighborhood. Both were known to speak with Charlene. Detectives believed Charlene had been seen near their shop the night she disappeared. Soon, whispers turned into interviews, and interviews turned into surveillance. The police planted covert recording devices, hoping to capture conversations that might reveal what happened to Charlene. When officers reviewed the tapes, they believed they heard disturbing comments, enough to suggest that Charlene had been harmed and that her body had been disposed of. And so in 2005, two men were arrested, one accused of murder, the other accused of helping to dispose of Charlene's body. Blackpool held its breath. This felt like a breakthrough, but the truth was far more complicated. In 2007, the case finally went to court. The prosecution relied heavily on the covert recordings, audio that detectives claimed contained confessions, references to Charlene, and even grim descriptions of what might have happened to her. But the recordings were poor quality, fragmented, crackling, and difficult to decipher. Experts disagreed on what was actually being said. Transcripts varied, words were unclear, and worse, some officers had interpreted the audio in ways that defense lawyers argued were biased or inaccurate. As the trial unfolded, the jury became increasingly uncertain. Witnesses contradicted each other. Forensic evidence was non-existent, and the supposed confessions were impossible to hear clearly. When the verdict finally came, it wasn't a verdict at all. The jury failed to reach a decision. The case collapsed. The prosecution announced plans for a retrial, but within months, that collapsed too. There were simply too many problems. Unreliable audio, weak evidence, and serious concerns about how the investigation had been handled. Both men were formally cleared, legally innocent, free to walk out of court. The collapse of the trial left a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured some of the most disturbing rumors in modern British crime history. Wild claims spread through tabloids, forums, and whisper networks. Stories so graphic, so sensational, that they overshadowed the real tragedy, a missing girl whose fate remained unknown. None of those stories were ever proven. Most were based entirely on speculation. But they stuck, poisoning public understanding of the case and deeply damaging Charlene's grieving family. By the end of 2007, over 4 years after Charlene disappeared, the investigation lay in ruins. No convictions, no body, no definitive answers. A family destroyed by grief and public scrutiny, and a police force facing serious questions that would soon turn into formal scrutiny. The suspects walked free, the evidence was in tatters, and the truth felt further away than ever before. The Charlene Downes case had become one of the most controversial failed prosecutions in UK history, and worse still, the mistakes were only just beginning to surface. When the trial collapsed, it wasn't just a courtroom defeat. It was the moment the entire investigation began to unravel. Behind closed doors, Lancashire police already knew problems were coming. But nobody, not the public, not the Downes family, not even the officers on the front lines, realized just how deep the failures went. The IPCC steps in. With public confidence shattered, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, IPCC, launched a full-scale investigation into how the Charlene Downes case had been handled. What they uncovered was not a single mistake, but a cascade of failures. Recordings mishandled, evidence poorly logged, statements inconsistently taken, officers inexperienced, unsupported, and at times completely out of their depth. It wasn't corruption, it wasn't conspiracy, it was something far more common and far more dangerous: systemic incompetence. At the center of the storm were the covert surveillance recordings. These tapes were supposed to be the key to Charlene's case, the evidence that would show what happened to her. Instead, they became the nail in the coffin. The IPCC found that the audio was almost unintelligible. Officers disagreed on what was being said. Transcripts were influenced by what investigators expected to hear. Critical passages were interpreted, not proven. And the quality was so poor, experts said it should never have been used as foundation evidence. The prosecution had built its case on sand, and when the sand shifted, everything fell apart. The report highlighted issues so fundamental they should never have happened in a major investigation: poor note-taking, missing documentation, evidence that wasn't properly stored, key decisions not recorded, lack of oversight from senior officers. These weren't minor blunders, they were failures that directly shaped the outcome of a murder investigation. Failures that meant the truth about Charlene was buried beneath procedural error instead of uncovered through detective work. The Downes family had already lost their daughter. Now they were learning the investigation meant to find her had collapsed under its own weight. They weren't told how weak the case truly was. They weren't told how flawed the evidence had become. They weren't told the full story until the entire prosecution had fallen apart. The family said it felt like the system had abandoned Charlene twice, once when she disappeared, and again when the case failed. The IPCC recommendations were harsh: better training, better oversight, better procedures for covert evidence, and urgent reforms inside Lancashire police. But reforms couldn't undo the damage. The case couldn't be rebuilt, the tapes couldn't be fixed, the suspects could never be retried. The investigation into Charlene Downes, perhaps the only chance to learn the truth about what happened to her, had collapsed beyond repair. The most painful part? If the early investigation had been handled properly, if officers had documented evidence correctly, if the tapes had been treated with caution, if senior staff had stepped in sooner, Charlene's case might look very different today. Instead, 2 decades later, the truth remains locked behind silence, error, and the consequences of a broken investigation. When the trial collapsed, Blackpool didn't get answers. Instead, it got something far more destructive: rumors, myths, whispers that grew louder than the truth ever could. With no convictions, no body, and no clear explanation from police, a vacuum opened, and the public filled it with the wildest, darkest theories imaginable. Tabloids pounced on the story. Headlines became more lurid by the day, each one desperate to outdo the last. Online forums turned Charlene's disappearance into a breeding ground for speculation. People who had never met her, who had never been to Blackpool, suddenly believed they knew what happened. Social media, still in its early years, amplified every dramatic rumor: claims of secret confessions, claims of hidden evidence, claims of unimaginable acts, stories that were never proven, stories that were never supported by facts, stories that would haunt the Downes family for the rest of their lives. Then came the most infamous rumor: a claim so grotesque that it permanently distorted the public understanding of Charlene's case. It spread like wildfire. People repeated it as if it were fact. Tabloids hinted at it. Strangers whispered it in the street. But there was no evidence. None. It was a theory born from misheard audio, mistranslated transcripts, and a public desperate for answers in a case the police had mishandled. And once it took root, it never went away. The family begged people to stop repeating it. Investigators dismissed it, experts condemned it, but the damage was done. Charlene wasn't a headline. She wasn't a horror story. She wasn't an urban legend. She was a 14-year-old girl. But the rumors turned her into something else, a symbol, a shock piece, a story people repeated for drama, forgetting there was a real child behind the words. The misinformation had consequences. It drowned out real leads. It blurred the facts. It pushed genuine information into the background. It made the public distrust the police even more. And it re-traumatized the Downes family every single time it resurfaced. In a case already crippled by mistakes, the rumors became another layer of chaos, another reason why the truth slipped even further out of reach. Charlene's family didn't just lose their daughter. They lost their privacy, their peace, and any chance of mourning her without the world adding its own twisted narrative. Every invented story was another wound. Every conspiracy theory was another day they had to defend themselves. Every sensational headline was another reminder that the investigation had failed them. The rumors didn't just distort the case, they overshadowed it. The real story, a vulnerable girl who vanished, and a flawed investigation that collapsed, was buried beneath sensationalism. And in that noise, the truth became harder than ever to find. Years passed. The headlines faded. The rumors tangled themselves into knots too tight to untie. And yet, Charlene Downes was still missing. But a case like this doesn't stay quiet forever. Not when a family refuses to stop fighting. Not when journalists keep asking questions. Not when police know deep down that something went terribly wrong. Throughout the 2010s, bits of new information trickled in. Not enough for a breakthrough, but enough to make Lancashire police look again. Then in 2016, the investigation flickered back to life. Police announced fresh arrests linked to historic sexual offenses against vulnerable children in Blackpool. Not direct evidence of Charlene's fate, but enough to reopen the conversation about the dangerous environment she had been drawn into. Detectives admitted publicly that they had significant concerns about child exploitation in the area during the early 2000s. Concerns that were not fully addressed when Charlene first went missing. The message was clear. If Charlene was groomed, exploited, or harmed, it didn't happen in isolation. Behind the scenes, a new team of senior investigators reviewed the original files. Thousands of pages of transcripts, statements, tips, and reports. Old witnesses were tracked down. New forensic techniques were considered. Digital enhancements were applied to degraded surveillance audio and video. Much of it led nowhere, but some of it revealed something crucial. There were individuals linked to Blackpool's nightlife and takeaway scene. Individuals present in the area at the time, who had never been properly scrutinized because the early investigation collapsed so badly. The new team quietly reached out to them. Some cooperated, some refused, some had left the country. After years of silence, journalists began revisiting Charlene's story. Documentaries, podcasts, long-form investigative reporting. These weren't sensational retellings, they were deeper, more careful examinations of the failures, the evidence, and the unanswered questions. They brought new attention to witnesses who felt ignored the first time. They highlighted patterns of exploitation in early 2000s Blackpool, and they gave Charlene's family their voices back. One journalist described the case as a crime hidden in plain sight, a tragedy surrounded by failures, myths, and missed chances. As renewed coverage spread, something important happened. People began talking. Old friends. Now adults who were teenagers in 2003. Witnesses who never came forward out of fear. Others who felt they weren't taken seriously the first time. Some spoke about strange behavior they remembered. Others spoke about adults who shouldn't have been around children. A few described seeing Charlene in places the original investigation never documented. The information didn't solve the case, but it added depth to a picture that had long been painted in only two colors: the failed trial and the rumors that swallowed everything else. Even with renewed attention, one truth remains. There is still no body, no confirmed final sighting, no definitive timeline past 11 p.m. on November 1st, 2003. Every new lead is a step forward, but every step reminds us how much was lost during those critical early days. The hope that remains. 2 decades on, the case is technically still open. Police still appeal for information. Journalists still search for missing pieces. And Charlene's family still fight for answers. Because cases don't go cold on their own. They go cold when the truth is buried, by failure, by rumor, by time. And every so often something surfaces, a lead, a voice, a clue that might finally shine a light into the darkness where Charlene disappeared. The investigation isn't over, it has simply changed shape. Charlene's story is still being written, by those looking for justice and by those who refuse to let her name be forgotten. For most families, grief is something that eventually softens. For Charlene's it never did, because there was never a body, never a grave, never a moment where they could say, "This is where she rests." Every day since November 2003, Karen and Robert Downes have lived in a suspended kind of torture, halfway between hope and certainty, between imagining their daughter alive and facing the reality that she likely isn't. While police statements faded, while appeals became smaller, and while the country slowly moved on, her parents didn't. They pushed, they protested, they confronted officers, wrote letters, stood outside courtrooms, and spoke to anyone who would listen, insisting that the investigation into Charlene's disappearance was flawed, incomplete, or at times simply ignored. Karen Downes became the face of a mother drained by grief, but fueled by fury. She refused to be quiet. She refused to be polite. And she refused to accept that her daughter's case would be allowed to gather dust. Over the years, she publicly challenged Lancashire police, demanding to know why leads weren't followed, why evidence was lost, and why the people once accused of murdering her daughter had been allowed to walk free without retrial. Despite serious questions surrounding the original investigation, to some, Karen was too loud. To others, she was exactly what a mother should be when the world forgets her child. She held marches across Blackpool's promenade. She handed out flyers in wind and rain. She stood outside the same arcades and takeaways where Charlene used to wander, begging the town to remember. And she never stopped demanding one thing: where is my daughter? Even now, more than 20 years on, Karen still speaks about Charlene in the present tense. Not because she believes Charlene is alive, but because acknowledging her as gone feels like betraying her. Every interview, every anniversary, every heartbreaking statement, it all comes down to a single truth. Charlene's parents will die searching before they ever give up. Their fight is a reminder of something cold and cruel, that the justice system can fail, but a mother's desperation never will. Their lives froze on November 1st, 2003, and while the world moved on, they stayed right there, in that moment, pleading for answers that still haven't come. Charlene Downes vanished, but her parents never let her be forgotten. Not then, not now, not ever. By the time Charlene Downes had been missing for nearly 2 decades, a disturbing question began to surface. Not just among investigators, but among the public, journalists, and families of other missing children. Was Charlene really an isolated case? Or was Blackpool harboring something far darker? A predator operating in the shadows? Because Charlene wasn't the only vulnerable girl to vanish or come to harm in this seaside town. Not the only child exposed to the nightlife economy, the fast food strip, or the underbelly no tourist brochure ever mentions. Patterns began to emerge. Girls groomed in the same areas, children hanging around the same cluster of takeaways, arcades, and late-night venues. Reports of exploitation, trafficking, and organized networks circulating through the very streets Charlene walked on her last day. It wasn't just rumors. It wasn't just paranoia. There were other cases, other disappearances, other children caught in the same dangerous spiral, each one adding more weight to a terrifying possibility that Charlene may not have been the first, and she may not have been the last. Police denied links. Authorities insisted the cases were separate. But parents, campaigners, and locals weren't convinced because the similarities were too sharp, too deliberate, too difficult to ignore. Young girls, same hotspots, same vulnerabilities, same town that turned a blind eye for far too long. And when the original suspects walked free after the collapsed trial, when no new suspects were charged, when no further arrests came, the question grew louder. If they didn't kill her, then who did? Some believe in a lone predator, someone who knew how to move through Blackpool without drawing attention, someone familiar with a chaotic nightlife, someone who preyed on girls no one protected. Others think it goes deeper. A network, not an individual. A system built on exploitation, where children disappeared into the cracks and were never seen again. Whatever the truth is, one fact is undeniable. Charlene didn't just vanish. Someone made her vanish, someone who has never been caught. And if that person or people are still out there, Blackpool might still be living with a predator hiding in plain sight. The truth has never been uncovered. The case has never been solved. And until it is, the question will always hang over this town like a shadow. Was Charlene Downes the victim of a serial predator, or one part of something even worse? More than 20 years after Charlene Downes disappeared, the investigation sits in a strange limbo. Not cold, but not active. Not forgotten, but not solved. A case full of leads yet starved of answers. And with every passing year, 3 key theories continue to dominate the conversation. Theory 1. She was murdered by someone she knew. This is the theory police leaned on from the very beginning. Charlene was known in Blackpool's late-night circuit. She talked to people older than her. She moved in circles where some adults saw vulnerable girls as opportunities rather than children. Investigators believe she may have trusted the wrong person. Someone who groomed her, someone who offered her money or attention, someone who blended easily into the nightlife. The problem? Every known suspect walked free. Evidence collapsed. Key recordings were ruled unreliable, and no forensic trace of Charlene was ever found. This theory remains standing, but it has nothing to stand on. Theory 2. She was taken by an organized network. This is the darkest theory, and the one that refuses to die. Parents of other missing girls, local activists, and some insiders have all whispered a similar warning. Charlene didn't just vanish. She disappeared into something. Reports of grooming, exploitation, and trafficking were already circulating in Blackpool at the time. Girls her age were targeted. Several were approached. Some escaped. Some didn't. If Charlene was taken into a network, she wouldn't have been the only one. This theory explains why no body was found, why no CCTV captured her final movements, why certain witnesses suddenly became scared or silent. But there's a horrific shadow behind this idea. If this is the truth, the people responsible were never caught and may still be active. Theory 3. She was killed and disposed of quickly. This theory sits between the first two. It suggests Charlene crossed paths with someone unpredictable, dangerous, and impulsive. Someone who attacked her, killed her and disposed of her in a way that left no trace. Blackpool is filled with underground spaces, demolished buildings, back alleys, abandoned properties, and access to the sea, any of which could hide a body forever. This idea haunts many investigators. Her killer may have acted alone, but knew exactly what to do afterwards. Modern forensic tools can extract evidence older systems couldn't touch. DNA, audio analysis, and digital enhancement have solved cases twice as old. If any physical evidence still exists, even the smallest trace, it could change everything. If the person responsible has harmed before or since, a future arrest could connect back to Charlene. Serial offenders leave patterns. All it takes is one match. It happens more than people think. As criminals age, guilt or fear of dying with a secret pushes them to confess. One statement, even decades late, could reveal where Charlene is. There is someone out there who knows exactly what happened, because they made it happen. Someone has carried this secret for more than 20 years. And until that person is exposed, the disappearance of Charlene Downes will remain one of Britain's darkest unsolved mysteries.